are so happy to have John Klintworth with us. John has been an employee here for about the last 2 years, and he has done a little bit of everything. So he's very valuable around here. He's also been going to UNK and working on his master's, which he will be finishing in December. So we'll be sad to see him leave. So one day I was here at the museum, and John and I were the two that were taking care of visitors and like that. And we got to chatting. He was telling me about the project he was working on for school. And I go, John, that would be perfect for Fabulous Friday, especially in November for Veterans Day. Can you have it ready? And he goes, Well, I just finished my 6-hour walk through the cemetery and got him picked out. Yeah, I can do it. So we are very happy to have John today. And thank you to John's family for coming to support him today. So John, it's all yours.
Okay, so I'll be talking to you today about some of the Civil War veterans that are buried in the Kearney Cemetery. Like Vicki said, I spent actually about 8 hours walking the lines because I sent an email to the cemetery office asking if they had a list. I never heard back from them. So each Civil War veteran has a little star, metal star next to their gravestone, so that's how you can tell if they're a veteran or not. But yeah, here we go. Hometowns and Heroes. That's what I called it. So I found 216 Civil War vets buried out there. There could be more. I could have missed some. I did notice some of this, like little stars were broken off or set to the side. So there could be more, so don't quote me. I found that Illinois was the best represented state in the cemetery. They had 42 veterans buried out there. Ohio was the second highest with 35. I didn't find anyone from Delaware, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, or Maryland. And there was one guy who was living in Nebraska at the start of the Civil War and joined a regiment. So that's pretty interesting as well. So we'll start with that guy from Nebraska. His name was James H. Tucker, and he joined the 1st Nebraska Infantry Regiment. He originally was born in Illinois, moved to Nemaha City. It's just called Nemaha now. It's in the southeast corner of the state, kind of by Brownsville, really southeast corner. He enlisted on June 13th, 1861. He initially fought in the Western Theater, so some of his significant battles he participated in were the capture of Fort Donelson and then Shiloh. In 1863, the 1st Nebraska transformed from an infantry regiment into a cavalry regiment, and when that happened, they got transferred out here to Nebraska, where they guarded the stage routes, the overland trails in Nebraska and Colorado against Native American attacks. And then once he was finished with once the war ended, he returned to Nebraska, originally to Nemaha City again. He became a teacher. He taught there for about 20 years, and then he moved to Kearney, where he taught again for about 15 to 20 years. So he was a pretty old guy when he retired from teaching, but yeah. Then we got John Doherty. His name was spelled quite a few different ways on his muster roll, so this is the one that's on his gravestone, so this is the one I'll use. He was enlisted at the 6th Iowa at the beginning of the war, so you can see there, July 17th, 1861. Originally born in Germany, he immigrated first to Ohio when he was a young man, and then further on into Iowa, where he joined up. He again fought in the Western Theater, and then he ended up managing the brickyard here in town. So the brickyard was located over on the runoff from the power plant, so kind of just down the street here, if you think about it. Some of the major battles that he fought in were Shiloh. He was at the Siege of Corinth. He was at Vicksburg. He was at the Battle of Atlanta. He participated in the March to the Sea with Sherman, so from Atlanta to Savannah. Then he marched with Sherman again up through the Carolinas, fought in one of the last battles of the Civil War at Bentonville in North Carolina, and he participated in the Grand Review, which was a 3-day-long parade of the Union troops through Washington, D.C. So that was pretty impressive. Our next guy, we got Robert Staton. He was in the 10th Missouri. Originally, I was kind of excited because Missouri, I thought maybe he was a Confederate, but he wasn't. I thought it would be pretty interesting to find some Confederates in our graveyard, but there actually weren't any, which will be a big point of emphasis here in a couple slides. So Robert Staton, 10th Missouri, he enlisted sometime in 1861. I couldn't find a definitive date on that, but he fought in the Western Theater again. Some of his major battles were Corinth and Iuka in Mississippi. He actually was wounded at Iuka, Mississippi. He got shot just below his right eye, and the ball stayed lodged in his head. So he got discharged after that, moved to Kearney sometime in 1880, and he lived at 1911 Avenue D. He has a quite interesting way he died. He was sitting at his kitchen table one day and just fell over dead. The doctor thinks that the ball finally moved and touched his brain in a way that just caused him to die. So, yeah, they made quite an emphasis on that in his obituary. This guy has a pretty interesting story as well. William H. Pettit, 2nd New York Heavy Artillery. So his unit mustered in August 1861. They originally, for most of the war, they were stationed in the defenses of Washington, D.C. So during the Civil War, Washington, D.C. was actually the most heavily fortified city in the world. So some of the battles he participated in, they went to Second Bull Run. He participated in Grant's Overland Campaign, which included battles like Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, North Anna, Petersburg, Fort Stedman, and Appomattox Courthouse. If you're familiar with the Civil War, some of those names are pretty bloody. He was originally in a heavy artillery unit, but after some of those battles in the Overland Campaign, they started running out of infantry troops, so they started pulling artillerymen and cavalry and using them as infantry. So he did see quite a bit of fighting up close and personal. It said there was 24 artillery units that were transformed into infantry units during that time, and his was the 8th most, or his unit suffered the 8th most casualties out of those units. So then he ended up moving to Kearney sometime. There wasn't really a firm date on that, but he farmed about 12 miles northwest of town here. His obituary called him quarrelsome. So the story went, he and his son were fighting a lot. He ended up moving in with the neighbors, so his wife and his son were living on his homestead. One day the son was out farming, plowing horses, and he had a shotgun with him to shoot ground birds or other varmints that he saw. And when he was heading back to put the horses back in the barn, Dad showed up and was standing in the door of the barn and wouldn't let his son put the horses back in the barn. So they got into a little scuffle, and the son said he pushed the dad with the shotgun and it went off. The obituary said it blew his shoulder off, but that didn't kill him. So then Mom came running over and she tried to wrestle the gun away from the son, and during that the gun went off again, and the obituary says it blew the guy's head off. But so then the son turned himself in. There was a full court hearing. The court house wasn't big enough to hold it, so they first moved the hearing into the skating ring. That turned out to not be big enough either, so they moved it into the opera house. So it was quite a trial. The son did end up getting arrested for manslaughter, and he spent about 10 years in the state pen. So that one was a little interesting to read. Then here's our second murder victim, allegedly. So James Monroe Hopwood, he joined the 22nd Iowa, mustered into service in 1862. He also fought in the Western Theater. His unit went all over the place, actually. They fought in most of the major battles in the West, and then they transferred to the East. If you look at his gravestone here, it says, wounded at Winchester, Virginia, October 19th, 1863. That's actually incorrect. There was 3 battles of Winchester, one in 1862, June 26, 1862. The second battle of Winchester was June 13th through the 15th, 1863. And then the third battle of Winchester was September 19th, 1864. So I'm guessing he was in the third battle, so this would have been a year earlier, and he needed to be September, so that's one of the gravestones that I found that was incorrect. His unit was actually located in Louisiana during October 63, but he fought at Port Gibson, which is on the Mississippi River, Vicksburg, Jackson, Mississippi, and then again here at Winchester. So then, yeah, I talked about how he fought in the Shenandoah Valley, and then he also died in a pretty strange way. So you can see he was killed here in town by Dr. Kern in 1892. How this obituary went, Dr. Kern approached him walking down the road, and there was something amiss about his church subscription. Apparently Mr. Hopwood wasn't paying for it. And there was a little scuffle, and Dr. Kern ended up stabbing him in the eye with an umbrella. Fell over, and all the witnesses said he laid on the ground screaming. He ended up living for about 10 days after this, but ended up dying from infection. This is what I assume killed him. Dr. Kern did go on trial for this, but he did not get convicted of anything, so he walked away a free man. Dr. Kern did end up leaving town after that, by the way. And then here's probably the most interesting guy that I found. Mr. Frederick J. Switz joined the 42nd Ohio. And if you can see here on his gravestone, it actually says CSA right there. So I thought maybe I did find a Confederate after all. But alas, I did not. He was born in Prussia originally. Him and his family moved over. They settled in Ohio. He grew up near Cincinnati. He learned to build chairs and other furniture in Cincinnati. Then the war broke out, and he ended up joining a unit, the 42nd Ohio, which was commanded by James Garfield, who would later become president of the United States. He fought in the Western Theater, so he fought in battles again like Port Gibson, Vicksburg, and then the Red River Campaign. So you'll notice a lot of these guys fight in the same battles. But then he moved to Alabama after the war and started a chair company there in Auburn. Was there for about 5 years. Then he moved to Kearney in 1874. He opened a furniture store here in town as well. He was an undertaker here in town. He ended up selling off his furniture store and opening a glass company and a paint company. So yeah, he was a pretty interesting guy. Another interesting thing about this gravestone that's incorrect is he was actually, he died in 1918. So his death date is also incorrect on this gravestone. So we've been joking that he must have really made the other undertakers mad to get his gravestone messed up so bad.
Question for you. You said that stone has a CSA on it?
Yep.
Can you determine, since he wasn't Confederate, what the CSA in this case represented?
I don't know. I just assume Confederate States of America, because I don't know what else it would be.
And my great-great-grandfather's Confederate, and he's got a Confederate stone down in Bartley, Nebraska, that says CSA on it.
Yeah, so I think they just messed it up.
Republic. But medallion there.
Yeah, like this
Yeah.
one's also,
Yeah.
the Confederate, it says Confederate veterans on this as well.
It says what?
It says Confederate veterans on his stone, or on this, metal
Oh,
star.
then it is?
Yeah, but I found that I found his actual muster roll, it was online, and you can see his name right there, 1861, he joined the 42nd Ohio, and, was there the whole time, so I don't have any explanation on why.
He was a spy.
I have a spy in here, so, well, a story of a spy, so we might get to that. But yeah, it's really interesting. Well, and then another thing, so he has another headstone that just says his name and then his death date and birth date, and that one is correct with his death date. So I don't know how this one got so messed up. It's next to it, like, yeah. And he didn't have a son with the same name or anything, so this was just very interesting when I found it. So, and I just started digging and digging.
Not literally, I hope.
Not
But this stone seems to be much newer.
I have no explanation. Like, and I found his obituary. Like, it was hard to find his obituary because I was like looking on this, and I was like, okay, so I'll look in the Kearney Hub, 1899, and found nothing. So then I expanded that, and I found it about like what 20 years later. So, yeah, very interesting.
Question for you. You're talking about the East, I'm not familiar enough with the Civil War. Where was the difference between the Western Theater?
Usually people divide that on the Appalachian Mountains. So that's how,
Anything east of the Appalachian Mountains?
yeah, it would be Eastern Theater, west would be west of the Appalachians. Okay, so then we get to George Smith. He was in the 1st New Hampshire Heavy Artillery. He enlisted pretty late in the war, so 1864. His unit was only ever stationed in the Washington defenses. On the night that John Wilkes Booth died, he was assigned a squad of soldiers to search the city and help look for him. So it's a pretty interesting story to read about. He ended up moving to Gibbon in 1871. He held a bunch of local offices. He was on a bunch of the school boards, all that kind of stuff. He also ran for state senate and actually became a judge here. So we got a little picture of him and his family. So if I found pictures of these guys, I included them. Just this is a little more than just their gravestones. So
John?
Yep.
Did he come, you would know this, he came out with a group of veterans to give them, when they had, what's that called?
Soldier Free Homestead Colony.
Yeah,
I'd have to look at the roster.
yeah, I'm not sure if he was part of that group, but Gibbon did start as a veterans colony, so he very well could have. After the war, he ended up moving back to Vermont for a little bit and running a hotel, and then he moved out here in, like I said, 1871. And he said the first couple winters were very cold, and they had a lot of blizzards. So that's about all I have on him. And then we get to our spy, or I guess he married a spy, allegedly. But we got Lloyd D. Forehand. He was part of the 5th New Hampshire Infantry Regiment. He enlisted at 16 in 1861, fought through the first couple of years. He was wounded both at Fredericksburg and Fair Oaks. So Fair Oaks was part of the 7 Days Battles when they were marching into Richmond in 1862. He ended up getting discharged after he was wounded at Fredericksburg, but he re-enlisted in what's called the Veterans Reserve Corps. So this was for soldiers who were wounded and got discharged, and they wanted to re-enlist, but they weren't going to put them into like a frontline unit. So they were guarding like bridges, cities, things like that. But he also served as an honor guard for Lincoln's body when they were moving it from DC to Springfield for the burial. So he rode the train with Lincoln's body all over the country when they were moving it around. And then I found this funny story. He possibly married a Southern spy. When he was part of that Veterans Reserve Corps, he was stationed in DC, and his job was partly to move messages from the telegraph office to Lincoln, so he was interacting with Lincoln quite often. And he met a girl who was Mary Todd Lincoln's personal assistant. She has a whole nother weird story where she might have been enlisted as a male in a northern unit and fought and then was wounded, and then they didn't pay her, so then she went to Lincoln to like petition for her money back, but that might not be true. All of this whole story came at this guy's deathbed. He told his granddaughter when he was dying, so who knows what's actually true and not. Anyway, he met this girl. They had a quick little romance, ended up getting married, and went back to his home in New Hampshire for the honeymoon, where she met his family and everything. And he said he started noticing she was going on like long walks and disappearing for time that he couldn't explain. And during this time in New Hampshire, there was a raid from Canada of Confederate spies on St. Albans. They robbed a bank. So he says that she was helping them with that. But then they go back to DC and she's disappearing again. And he goes up to Lincoln and tells him, hey, I think she's a spy because she's disappearing for all this time. So then they plant some fake information for her to hear. And the spy ring, the Pinkertons were around. So that ended up hearing that a couple days later, this fake information from the tavern where she was known to be the night that it happened. Forehand went up to her, accused her of being a spy, and she pulled a gun on him and was threatening to shoot him. But then the other police showed up and they eventually got the gun off of her and pulled her away. So who knows if any of that is actually true. But it was a very interesting story to read. But he did end up getting divorced from her after the war. Moved to Buffalo County in 1872. Then he moved into Kearney in 1885, where he lived at 2718 First Avenue. He ran a bunch of the stuff in town. So he was a superintendent of the First City Waterworks. So he supervised the construction of the canal and a bunch of the other waterworks around. He was the Kearney Street Commissioner, so he was in charge of all the street planning and stuff like that. And then he was also a superintendent of the Frank Improvement Company. So he had quite an influence on Kearney during his time here. This guy also has an interesting story. So Edwin Bartlett, 4th U.S. Cavalry. When I think he was 14 or 17, one of those. He walked from Wisconsin to Omaha in 1848 to join John C. Fremont on his travel across the country when they went to California and kind of started an uprising, and that's all the Mexican-American War stuff. But when he reached Fort Kearney, he ended up leaving the Fremont expedition and joined the regular army because the Mexican-American War broke out, and he went down south and fought during that war. And then after this war, he became a scout and a guide guarding wagon trains west to like California and Oregon. If you've ever heard of the Mountain Meadows Massacre, he survived that. That was an attack by Mormons in Utah on a wagon train. And then he also survived 12 battles against the natives before he even got to the Civil War. Some of the battles he fought in the Civil War, Stones River, Chickamauga, and then he was part of operations throughout Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia as well. And then towards the end of his life, he actually went to England with Buffalo Bill on their tour out there, so it's a little world traveler. Then we get William Wallace Patterson. He was officially in the 12th U.S. Infantry Regiment, but he was born the son of a New York senator. His uncle was the governor of New York at the time. He's a relative of the Frank family. If you're from Kearney, you've heard of the Frank family. They got their house. They helped fund a whole bunch of stuff here in town. Both his parents died when he was 7, within 2 weeks of each other. So he was orphaned, and he lived with his uncle, the governor. He had another uncle that was a major in the army. So he kind of passed around between his family. But when he came of age, he went and worked for his relative Augustus Franks in his dry goods store, still in New York. While he was working in that dry goods store, he joined the New York State Militia as their quartermaster. Eventually, the other officers in that unit would quit and leave, so he actually became the leader of that unit in 1855. The next year, he wanted to move off on his own, so he moved to Minnesota in 1856. He settled near present-day Minneapolis. Minneapolis wasn't really there at this time, but then in 1861, when the war started, with his experience in the militia, he tried to raise a regiment of volunteer troops in Minnesota. In his biography, it says some promises to him weren't kept, so he left and then enlisted as a private in the 12th U.S., where he quickly rose to the rank of sergeant and then lieutenant. Some of the battles he fought in were Yorktown, the 7 Days battles, Second Bull Run, Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, and then the Wilderness. So he saw quite a bit of battle as well. He was wounded both at Gettysburg and the Wilderness. At Gettysburg, he got hit by a piece of shrapnel from a cannonball in his leg, I believe. And then at the Wilderness, he got another wound in his ankle, which caused him to not, he wasn't able to serve anymore after that. He would eventually rise, so after Gettysburg, he got promoted to captain, and he became a staff officer with his division commander. And then before the Battle of the Wilderness, he was promoted again to lieutenant colonel, and he was in charge of the entire 5th Corps engineer unit. So he became pretty important in the Army at that point. Anyway, after the war, he moved back to Minnesota, became an early booster of Minneapolis, so he was promoting it as this big manufacturing town because of the power of the river. He saw the potential that it could have with that water power, as flour mills and other kinds of manufacturing could work there. Lived there for a couple years. He got voted into the legislature for a couple years, and then the weather up there is really harsh in the winter. And with his wounds, they were causing him a lot of discomfort, and he was getting sick a lot. So he decided he needed to move to a better climate, where he moved to Iowa and started working for the CB&Q Railroad. As part of that work, he came out to Lowell, which is by Fort Kearney, and planned that town out. And then on that same trip, he chose Kearney, the site of what would become Kearney. So he's kind of the founder of Kearney. And since he's a relative of the Franks, he's probably a big part of the reason that they ended up coming here anyway. Probably had a lot of money invested in this area before it was really anything. Okay, so then we get John Benjamin Neal, 2nd Illinois Light Artillery. He enlisted in 1863, fought in 2 major engagements, the Second Battle of Fort Donelson, which is in Tennessee, and then Pine Bluffs, which is in Arkansas. The reason I chose him was because of this story about being surrounded by 60 gorillas. Not actually like monkey gorillas, but that's what they call partisan fighters or regulars. So this story was in his biography. He and another person in his unit were on a scout or moving somewhere where they eventually were surrounded by these 60 guys getting shot at. Long story short, they ended up killing 18 of them, and both of them escaped without any wounds to themselves. So it's pretty amazing that 2 guys fought off 60 and got out of there unscathed. He eventually would move to Odessa in 1875. He became a justice of the peace in town there, and then he would move to Oregon, And then a couple weeks before he died, he was sick and he came back and was staying with his son again in Odessa, where he would eventually pass away. And that's why he's buried here. Okay, then we get to John Wesley Parker, 84th Ohio. He would eventually enlist 3 times in the Union forces. So like you see there, he enlisted in 1861, got sick and was discharged because they didn't think he was going to get better. He did get better again, and so he enlisted in 1862, fought in a lot of battles in both the West and the East, so his unit was one of those that moved all over the place. So one of his first major battles was at Vicksburg. He fought at Knoxville, and then his unit moved to the east, fighting in the wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, Petersburg, Fort Stedman, and Appomattox Courthouse. He also participated in the Grand Review, so he was part of that big parade. He moved to Kearney in 1874, and then his son became some big painter guy, I guess. It was a major part of his obituary, talking about how his son became a painter and went to Paris to study painting, and him and his wife moved to Paris with him and lived there for a couple years before they moved back to Kearney. Never heard of his son before, so he must not have been that good. So then we get Owen Littleshaw, 44th Indiana. He enlisted on August 23rd, 1861. He was commended for bravery a couple of times during his service. He fought at Fort Donelson. He got wounded at Shiloh. He got shot in the mouth, so that would have probably been very painful. Came back from that. He became a color bearer at Stones River. He was again wounded. This time he got hit in the arm and in the nose. And then at Chickamauga, he was wounded a 3rd time, just in his arm again. He was promoted to lieutenant in 1864. They called for being an uneducated gentleman or something like that, which I thought was a weird reason to be promoted. But then it must not have been a very good promotion because he was forced to resign in 1865. His resignation was accepted for, quote, alleged incompetency and the good of the service. So, who knows what he did? I'm sure that's probably a pretty interesting story as well. But he would move to Nebraska in 1874. He moved around a lot. He first settled in Fillmore County, moved to Frontier County where he had a timber claim. Then he moved to Hayes County after that. He didn't stay in one place for very long. Then he moved to Kearney, and he would die at 2017 Avenue F. Hopefully no one lives there. But the story is he was walking home from church, and eventually the sheriff walked by and he was just laying on the street, so they think he had like a heart attack or something outside of his house. Eliza Cunningham Calkins, 10th New York Cavalry. So his unit mustered in 1861. He fought in the East again. Some of his major battles: Fredericksburg, Gettysburg, the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, Petersburg, Appomattox Courthouse. And he also rode in the Grand Review. He would arrive in Buffalo County in 1873. He became a state senator for the area in 1877. He was a major proponent, and he authored the laws for irrigation canals in the area. So he was a big part of this area and farming and agriculture all over the state. He would become the president of the State Bar Association. He was also a regent of the University of Nebraska. And then another little funny story about him. When he was a young up-and-coming lawyer here in town, he was chosen to be the referee to decide whether Juanita or Hastings would become the capital of Adams County, or Juniata. Juniata's how you pronounce that one. Juanita's down by my hometown. But yeah, so he got to decide who would become the county seat of Adams County. Okay, then we get Warren Caswell, 7th Iowa. He was born in Illinois. In the 1850, he went to California for the gold rush. He apparently made quite a bit of money because he took a boat to get back to the east, so he went all the way down around South America. But he ended up getting married and was living in Iowa at the time of the Civil War. He enlisted on February 12, 1864. His unit immediately went to Atlanta, where he marched with Sherman on his march to the sea. He participated in that Carolinas campaign where they marched from Savannah north through south in North Carolina. Fought at Bentonville, again, one of the last major battles of the Civil War, and participated in the Grand Review. When he returned home, he found out both of his children had died while he was serving in the Army. So him and his wife first moved back to Illinois before coming out to Nebraska, which they moved to Buffalo County in 1880. They settled near present-day Pleasanton, just a little northwest of town. But yeah. Holloway Whitfield Kinney, 15th New Jersey Infantry Regiment. So he enlisted in August 1862. He fought in most of the major battles in the east. So again, we're going through Fredericksburg, Gettysburg, Spotsylvania, Winchester, Fort Stedman, Petersburg, Appomattox Courthouse. He fought in a unit. They said they were all farmers, so they were of the most robust health. So who knows how good they were. But he ended up moving to Nebraska in 1878, settled in the Thornton Township, and he was a big proponent of raising fruit trees and that kind of stuff. So we talked about last Fat Friday, we had the guy who came in and talked about trees, and he talked about a lot of these farmers out here were starting to plant trees and raise trees. So this is a good example of one of those farmers that participated in that. And I actually, while I was looking through our archives the other day, I found his discharge papers. So here's a couple examples of his discharge papers up here you can look at. I made copies of them, so after we're done, if you want to look at those. Then Daniel Aaron Crowell, 137th Pennsylvania. He enlisted on August 30th, 1862. Mustered out on June 1st, 1863. So he wasn't one of these guys that stayed throughout the duration of the war. He moved to Buffalo County in 1869, settled near present-day Odessa, which at the time I believed was called Cranelton.
Carlton.
Well, it was Cranelton, and then it got changed to Crolton because of this guy, and then it became Odessa. So I had this talk with a tour I gave a couple weeks ago. So yeah, it's very, very interesting how many times Odessa's changed its name. But when he first moved here, he taught first grade here in town, so he'd ride the train into town. And this tour I was giving is telling me stories about how he always had to carry a pistol with him because the coyotes were always so bad when he'd get off the train. I don't know if that's true. This is just a story I heard. But in 1875, he ended up moving just on the other side of Kearney to Buda, where he was still teaching. And from 1872 to 1873, he was superintendent of the schools in the county. So. William H. Kilgore, 1st Pennsylvania Light Artillery. He enlisted in 1861. A cool story about him was his artillery battery was one of the first to enter Richmond after it fell. So some of his major battles were the 7 Days, Second Bull Run, Antietam, Fredericksburg, Petersburg, and Richmond. So then after the war, he started carpentry business and a lumber yard in Pennsylvania before he moved to Buffalo County in 1872. He started buying up land and raising cows. Then he moved to Custer County to expand even more in 1876. And then after that, he traveled to Utah, Montana, Iowa, and Minnesota. each time trying to grow his fortune a little more. Before he decided Kearney was the place for him, so he moved back, bought land on a farm in Drover Island. I don't think those exist anymore. They probably went away when the water was taken, but he ended up owning over 1,500 acres of land in Buffalo County, on both these islands and then also in the town of Kearney. He rented out a bunch of that ground for income. So he had grazing land, farmland, and then town lots. So he would rent all that out to people. And then his obituary told me how he died as well. So one day he was out talking to some of his workers at the barn, just giving them orders on what to do for the day. And when he was going back to the house, they said he took 2 steps up the stairs, let out a really weird cry, and then fell over backwards. And by the time they got to him, he was dead. So who knows?
Could this be Kilgore Island?
Could be. It could be named after him as well. I
Yeah.
didn't find anything.
I can comment, it's Fort Farm Island and Drover Island.
Mhm.
They're separate islands. You look at the old maps, but the channel that was between them had mostly dried up. And so a lot of times the island is now known as Kilgore Island and Kilgore Road, which comprises what is Fort Farm and Drover Island, because the channel that separated them isn't really there anymore. You can still see it though, the Kilgore Road is just outside of where the channel is, and you still occasionally see references to both of those islands.
There you go.
Kilgore Island sometimes pronounced, called, combined thing between two of them.
There you go.
It's in between Min exit and Given exit, south side of the interstate.
Okay, thank you. So then we get to John Swinson, 56, Illinois. He was born in Sweden. He moved to Norway as an apprentice in a shop before he immigrated to the U.S. in 1861. He actually arrived in Chicago on July 4th, 1861. He got a job on a boat running in the Great Lakes before the war. Well, I guess the war was going on at that point, but he was only in the country for 2 months before he joined up with the Union forces on September 10th, 1861. He fought at Fort Donelson, Shiloh. He got wounded in the back. And then in Corinth, he got wounded in the arm, which resulted in the amputation of that arm. He stayed in the military though. He became an assistant to the quartermaster of his brigade. So he served throughout the war. After the war, he ended up going back to Illinois, where he went to a soldier's college and got a degree, so he became a teacher. Then him and his wife moved to Iowa, where they taught school children for a couple years, before they moved to Buffalo County in 1873. They settled up near Sartoria, in the Sartoria Township. In his little biography that I found, it said he's the one that actually came up with the name Sartoria and Sartoria Township. So he's pretty important up there. And then he bought 1,500 acres of land up there. He ran the Swinson Ranch, which they said employed all of the young men in the area, even to that day, which I found his biography in a book from 1920s. But then in 1911, he ended up moving to Lincoln, where he would die and get sent back here to be buried. Then we get Freeman Merriman, 102nd Illinois. He enlisted in August 1862, fought in the West again. Some of his major battles include Atlanta, Kennesaw Mountain. He was on the March to the Sea, again, Carolina's campaign, Bentonville, and the Grand Review. His biography said his unit was issued Spencer repeating rifles, so they were often in the heaviest of the fighting because they were fighting against guys with muskets, so they want to put the guys who could shoot faster in the heaviest parts of the fighting. After the war, him and his wife moved to Moline, Iowa, where he worked for John Deere for quite a few years. He was a foreman in the carpentry works, and then he was just a general supervisor of one of their plants. Made quite a bit of money doing that. I think it said he was getting paid like $5,000 a year in that time. Don't quote me, I don't really remember that part, the amount of money, but he was quite wealthy when he ended up moving to Nebraska in 1883. He owned a bunch of property around the county, didn't really work when he was living here, but just rented out that property as a way of having income.
Hey, John?
Yep.
The emblem that he's wearing on his, any idea what that is?
It's one of his medals. I don't think it's the Medal of Honor, but it's it could be like a GAR medal, which is the Grand Army of the Republic. I'm not too sure. It's not very clear in any of the pictures, so it's just a 5-pointed star. So
Obviously, he's very proud of it.
yeah, we actually have this picture in the back in like a big frame and stuff too. So if you want to see a better picture of him. Then James Inglis Gillespie, 1st Kentucky Cavalry. He has a pretty interesting story. So he enlisted in 1861. He lived near Danville, Kentucky. He fought in just a couple of battles, so Perryville, and then he was wounded at New Philadelphia and taken prisoner by the Confederates. He was imprisoned in Belle Isle, Pemberton Castle, and Andersonville. He escaped from Andersonville with one of his comrades, but was caught by bloodhounds. Got taken back to Andersonville, where he was placed in irons. Him and another one of his comrades were able to file off these irons, and they escaped again. They were eventually captured and taken to Macon Prison, where they were placed in solitary confinement. And then him and a major would escape from that prison, and they eventually made it to Union lines around Atlanta in 1864. After that, he was able to get out of the army, so it took him through prison escapes, but he did it. He taught himself and began to practice law after the war in Kentucky before he moved to Kearney in 1878. One of his first jobs here in town was he was a principal of the school, and he served as a county judge for 3 years. When his second re-election came up, he actually died before the results were announced, but he ended up winning, so poor guy could have been a judge again. So they had to give it to the guy who got second place. So then we get Joseph Sampson Wiley, 8th Illinois. This is the last guy I'll talk a bunch about because he's actually the last Civil War veteran that was buried in the Kearney Cemetery. He died in September of 1940. But he mustered into the Union Army on April 25th, 1861. He again fought throughout the Western Theater, participating in battles like Fort Donelson, Shiloh, Corinth, Port Gibson, Vicksburg, and he helped capture Mobile, Alabama. His family moved to Buffalo County in 1894. They lived at 115 East 30th Street. He actually attended the Veterans Reunion at Gettysburg in 1938. There are some videos of that if you're interested in seeing some of that kind of thing. But like I said, he was the last Civil War veteran to be buried here in town. And then these two guys, I could find just about nothing on. They died here in town before the Kearney Hub started, so there are no obituaries on them. But I thought they were just really interesting. So Jubilee F. Chase, it just says U.S. Navy on his gravestone. So yeah, I think it would be cool to figure out if he served on a ship or what he did. There's really nothing else on him. And then he was the only U.S. Navy veteran that I found buried in the cemetery from the Civil War. So that's why I found it interesting. And then Alexander G. Willis, he served in the 61st United States Colored Troops. He wasn't African American. He was a sergeant, and then he eventually was promoted to lieutenant. I was able to find that, but I didn't find anything else on him. So he he was the only one that helped serve with U.S. colored troops as well. With that, that's all I got.
Any questions for John?
John, I got one.
Yeah.
You know, at the time, and they probably did they get military funerals? You know? And
So some of them did, some of them didn't. So in a lot of the obituaries when they died, they put out like, hey, GAR members, everyone come to this funeral. Like if they didn't have family, they'd invite all the GAR members and all that. But it wasn't really put on by like a government organization. It was usually handled by the GAR, if anybody.
I couldn't help but notice the treatment of those old tombstones by the Kearney Cemetery. They were all placed on nice concrete slabs. Very good treatment of those old tombstones.
Yeah. I didn't notice a lot of, when I was out there weren't a lot of poorly treated gravestones. Some of them I had a little trouble reading just from weathering and stuff, but there weren't any that were just damaged, outright damaged.
So it's, Kearney Cemetery is the only cemetery you walked through?
Yep. It took me 8 hours. I didn't want to do it.
You don't want to go through all the other ones?
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there might be some there.
Well, I'm sure there's other,
Yeah.
I'm sure there's other veterans buried all over the county.
Yeah.
Probably especially given, I think I saw in the archives when I was looking, I think there's some in like Riverdale and Amherst and that kind of stuff.
My great-grandfather's buried in Ravenna.
There
He
you go.
was a Civil War.
Yeah, I'm sure there's plenty all over the place.
Miller has a lot, the old Armada has a lot of Civil War veterans. Where I grew up north of Sumner, there's a little valley cemetery, and in the far corner, there's a Confederate and a Union buried side by side in that cemetery. Very sparsely populated cemetery, but I thought that was fun to see them laying there together peacefully.
So John,
Yep.
recently, Buffalo County Historical Society, in October, we had From Beyond the Grave, and we highlighted the Amherst Cemetery, and I portrayed Albert Phillips, who was a POW also in the Civil War, and he's buried in Amherst. So, to answer that question, there, Civil War veterans probably in every cemetery.
So those metal stars identify what war?
Yep, so.
Or their rank, or their.
Yep, so the Civil War veterans all had those little stars. Let's see if I can go back and find one. And then World War I, World War II, all had different, like, little metal symbols. The War on Terror, it had a different one. The trouble is, there's another, organization that has a star. The only difference is they don't have these little rounded points. It's like the POE. I don't know what the POE is, but.
That's the Elks.
Okay. Yeah, PEO.
It's a women's philanthropic educational organization,
Yeah.
women's group, yeah.
John?
Yep.
On those Civil War, on the Civil War veteran stones, aren't they round at the top? And then when you did the guy that said CSA, that's got a pointed, they were a separate, am I right there?
Well, I have to check, see, my
Yeah.
great-grandfather's stone.
Yeah, like I said, this says
It is.
Confederate States of
It
America
has
on it.
flat, and then, I'd have to see, given we have 35, 40, I don't know how many, we're doing an inventory for next year, but it's
Like you said, several
dozens.
things on the stone were wrong.
Yeah.
It could be a number.
I thought,
Yeah.
I think the stones were a different shape.
Yeah,
Are the stars, that whole system, is that statewide, nationwide, or is that?
I have no idea. That's just the Kearney one. I haven't looked in other cemeteries.
You mean the GAR?
He asked if this is a statewide thing.
No, it's national. That's national.
But,
So did you do this for your research project for your master's degree?
Yep.
Okay. And then did you present it?
not yet.
It's coming up.
Yeah.
Good luck.
So we went to practice.
Yeah. Well, so my master's thing, I did like a project, so this is part of the project. As well as my exhibit.
as you walk that cemetery, do your figure, for the total numbers, do your figures compare, right, according to what they have at the courthouse for our veterans?
I didn't look in any of the
You
courthouse
simply
records.
walk
I
the
just
court,
simply
the
walked it,
cemetery, okay.
And that's John, I got another.
Nope, during the day. It took me a whole Saturday, but I did it.
Were they, this is, were there, women did serve in the war, and like nurses, but some, were there any females up there that maybe were?
None of them had the star on them, so it's impossible to tell whether.
There were several that portrayed men that were.
Yeah, well, like I said, the guy who married the spy, her story was that she was an undercover soldier, and then she went to Lincoln to say that she was.
What happened to her, do you know? Did they ever say what happened?
Nah, I think she got thrown in prison.
Okay.
I think she got thrown in prison. But he didn't, I don't think he knew what happened to her afterwards because he got that divorce as soon as he could. Got out of there.
Any other questions?
Very good, John.
Yeah.